Everything is personal right here. Everything is personal right here.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to another episode of Everything is Personal. And today we have a special guest with us, Mr. Harrison Jordan. How are you, sir?
Good. How are you?
I'm good. So, all right, lots of different things. Cannabis attorney,
Yeah.
Canadian, I'm going to first say. So everybody knows you're extra nice and, you're going to be polite because that's Canadians are, right? So cannabis, then you have psychedelics, and then you have NFT.
Yeah.
How does that all fit together, or they don't? I'm just curious.
Oh, you would say that some parts of it might not fit together, but I've fit them together, even if it's sometimes putting a square peg in a round hole.
I like that. All right, so let's back up. Where you're Canadian, as we just said. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Toronto, Canada, where I'm still currently, and it's a great city. I like it, for better or worse. And grown up here my entire life.
Yeah, Toronto is great. In the wintertime, though, I'm from Philly and I moved to LA, I don't know, 12, 13 years ago. But I was in Toronto, I want to say sometime in November of last year. Man, this COVID time kind of it's weird. So I don't know, 1 year or so. It was so cold. And I didn't realize, and I had to take, the train. I'm taking the train back and forth. Like, do you know there's a whole underground city? I was like, no, I had no idea. I'm like, I went down a couple of times, but I didn't know you could go like practically almost anywhere and never come up outside. So that was a cool experience. I got to.
Yeah, well, we have the underground. What's it called? There's a certain name to it, but it's definitely convenient to use it walking downtown if you don't want to go up in the cold.
Yeah, that's why I moved from Philly to LA, because I don't like the cold, even though.
So then Toronto is not your cup of tea.
Yeah, no, I mean, like I said, I love Toronto. I love the restaurants. I like the nightlife. It's a city. It's got a vibe to it. But the weather, man, it's just not my thing.
Yeah, no, you can't compare it to the West Coast. That's for
sure.
Well,
the thing about that, I like living in California in general. Everything is close. So if I want snow, I can choose it. So I can drive an hour and a half, 2 hours and go skiing, Big Bear or whatever it is. So the last year I went from skiing in the same day to the beach.
Oh, that's great.
Day. So that's the rarity of California. So tell me a little bit about your childhood. Are you only child?
I have a sister. I have a sister that's 2 years younger than me. And I grew up in middle upper class family, I guess you could say, and parents have really supported me, and they're definitely a reason why I can do everything, and so they've been very supportive, and I was always interested in law, and I've had an interest in cannabis for a while, not since I was, I got an interest later in life, not when I was a little kid, obviously. But that's propelled me.
So when you were growing up and you had an interest in law, did you kind of go into it thinking, there's a gap, cannabis is something interesting, or was it like, I'm going to go and I'm going to defend, people, or I'm going to prosecute? Like, did you have a certain calling?
I don't know if I had a particular calling as to what kind of law, but I was just really turned on to law as a subject in high school. In grade 10, I was taking grade 11 law.
Right.
And that was fun. It was interesting to me. You learn about the constitutional cases in Canada that led to the laws that we have now. And the Constitution is a living, breathing document. So you have this compendium of all these cases that have changed for better or worse. How we treat certain things. So I always found that very interesting. The fact that you could change laws by taking cases to court. I don't do a lot of litigation these days,
Right.
but I always found that fascinating, how you can sculpt the law for better
Yeah.
or for
I was going to say, because looking at the U.S. and not making any political opinions, but like the Roe versus Wade going into the Supreme Court and having, you know, certain laws overturned, it's interesting how, you know, it can sway everything in a country with one single opinion.
absolutely.
I find it fascinating. So, law. Then, how did like cannabis come into your life from a vocational standpoint? I don't mean from your personal standpoint.
Yeah, I was interested in cannabis as a substance. I was interested in the fact that it was helping people, unlike some other substances that are more vice substances that don't really have many positives, or don't have a direct medicinal application, I should say, through their use. But I always found it fascinating. And when I was applying to law school, I applied to Osgoode Hall in Toronto, and I wrote in the entrance essay how I really found it, I guess, inspiring, or I don't know what word I used, but I was happy to see that they had tenured Alan Young, who was, and maybe still is. I mean, I don't think he'll ever get out of practice, but he was a cannabis lawyer that pushed to change the laws, pushed to change as well gambling laws, sex work laws, and he was actually successful with the sex work laws. But then the conservative federal government at the time basically changed things up and made it unlawful in a different way. But he was instrumental in going to court and challenging these laws. The cannabis law he wasn't successful at, but that was a long time ago when he went to the Supreme Court. Obviously now it's legal here in Canada, so things are different. And the cases and efforts he's been part of were very instrumental in later cases, you know, which then led to the government legalizing it. So I wrote how I thought it was great that they tenured him, even though he's outspoken. And then, long story short, I ended up being placed in his first year criminal law class. And then I started working for him. He was also the director of the Innocence Project at Osgoode Hall. So I would work half the time I would work on Innocence Project files, and the other half I would work on his cannabis related files. And I always found that it was a good interesting area of law to be in, and interesting people, interesting clients. You can get along with them. And so it's definitely something that I pursued after that. I then articled. You have to do like an internship in a sense, articling as they call it, at a law firm. And so I did that at the law office of Lewin and Segura, and they do cannabis law. That's their focus is cannabis and psychedelic law. And so from there, it was that was where I started. And the NFT stuff that came later on. When I started collecting NFTs. But you know, that was an exciting area that I more recently got into after the cannabis and psychedelics law.
Yeah, it just reminded my daughter's finishing. She's in her last year of high school, so she's applying to college, and essays are a big thing. You just reminded me of some of the stuff that she was talking to me about, because she wants to include like what her dad does for a living. She's like, how do I approach the subject of cannabis in my essay?
Right. I
said, you just speak about it. I've nothing to hide. We're legal, you know, in a way. I don't mean our company doesn't touch the plant, but you know, we're endocannabinoid adjacent, I guess, company. But you got to remove the stigma, because like she's still, you know, being around 18, she still understands what it was when it wasn't legal in a certain way. But like her kids will never be like, you made a plant illegal. You put people in jail for something that grows in the ground. It makes no sense. But let me circle back, and so if you can maybe frame a little bit for the people that may not know, what is the history in Canada of cannabis, and what is the current state of cannabis for people that don't know?
Well, if you wanted to go all the way back, you could go back to Jacques Cartier and him bringing in hemp into Canada. Can't detect. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay. Got a bunch of Zoom messages saying can't detect, so I thought I would maybe silent. Anyways, I guess let's restart that. So in terms of the history of cannabis in Canada, you could go back all the way to Jacques Cartier, him bringing in hemp. And just like the US, cannabis wasn't always illegal. In fact, when it was added to the list of controlled substances, what is now the CDSA, the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, there were some lawmakers that answered the record of what they said. It seemed like they were not aware that cannabis was actually added to the list. They said, "Oh, we seem to have a new substance," something along those lines. And so that was really when the story of cannabis being illegal was started. And then as we got cannabis had been illegal since then, in different I guess degrees, you could say. I guess you could say things got the harshest around the 70s was when the laws were probably the harshest. And then in the 80s, you got the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, that was brought into Canada, promulgated into law. And then you started seeing charter cases where people were either charged with criminal offenses related to cannabis or controlled drugs, or you had people going to court and proactively challenging the validity of certain laws under the charter. And that's when we started to see a string of constitutional cases that had to do with medical cannabis, and slowly chipped away at what was not permitted. The courts had said there needs to be a medical program. You need to have reasonable access to cannabis for those who use it medicinally.
Hey, just to interrupt you and ask a question really quick, just because it'll escape if I don't. Was there a certain type of medical condition that was prevalent that were doing so the reason why I asked this, in the US, the big push for legalization came from the AIDS community.
Right.
It was a major push that was
so similar to how some states have it now, or have had it in the past. There was a list of conditions that you had to you had to have, and then there were some conditions where if you had it, but you got a specialist of that condition to attest that you had it, then you could be eligible. And things changed in about 2013, where after a number of court cases, the government said, we're going to refashion the medical program. We're going to make it so that any provincially authorized prescriber, so in this case, that's doctors, physicians, as well as nurse practitioners, so not registered nurses, but they go through a few more years and then they become a nurse practitioner. And there might be some other occupations that are authorized prescribers in other provinces, but that's what I know for Ontario. They were able to prescribe it to any patient that's under their care. Doesn't matter what the condition is. And now it's relatively it's relatively easy to get a medical document, which is access to medical cannabis. It's just that you have to get it through a courier now, or you. But before that, it was still through courier. It was single sourced from a mine in Manitoba, and so they switched from that to allowing the private sector to really come in, and there's more than 1,000 now federally licensed cannabis producers, wholesalers, and medical sellers. And so now they've really opened it up. And if you want to get a medical document, you can get it. But there's some things that are weird, such as you can only access cannabis not through the mail, not through, well, I guess you could say it's through the mail. It's through Canada Post, right? But you have to pay to get it through Canada Post or some other courier, and it arrives at your residence. Whereas recreational cannabis, when that was brought in 2018, the sale of recreational cannabis was to be managed by the provinces. And so you have stores in certain provinces all over the place. In Ontario, we have that. We've got a private model where you can open up a store anywhere that was already zoned retail, and that's not within 150 meters of a school. So tons of them have popped up here in a relatively short period of time. But you have the federal government looking over the medical cannabis regime, and you can only receive it via post, via courier. And then you have the recreational regime where you have these stores on every block, and they're very easy to get into, but they can't make any representations about health or medical benefits. And there's some push from some producers, with the products that they carry, they like intimating that, oh, it's to be used as nighttime, maybe it'll be good for sleep, but we can't 100% say that. But really, they're two different systems. Though, I'm surprised we haven't recently seen any challenges to the medical system saying, how can this be not as accessible as the retail for recreational? And the retail for recreational, the pricing is usually as inexpensive or cheaper than what the person can get directly from a producer, because the producer wants to have higher margins on their direct to patient. Or it only makes sense, sometimes because the patient market is smaller here relative to the recreational market. So that's been basically what's happened. Is we had the charter in the 80s. We had all these cases that chipped away at the laws against medical use. A program was established. It was brought in to be more friendly to the private sector, you could say, although there are significant challenges that the cannabis industry faces, including excise duty. That's like the sin tax that a producer has to pay. It's generally $1 per gram, which doesn't seem like a lot, but when prices of cannabis are going down and you have to factor in all the other costs that you have to pay for, and the fact that it's a multi-tiered system, you sell it to the province or the wholesaler that the province runs, the provincial government runs, which then sells it to stores, which then sells it to, it's not fully vertically integrated like states have been. And so for better or worse, we have things differently and we have challenges. But we've seen a system that has, at least when it comes to production, really promulgated this hyper competitive industry, for better or worse. And there are challenges, and there are onerous application requirements, and Health Canada is not known for being lax on things. So for better or worse, we have a reputation of being regulated, but still being a market that allows the private sector to come in, and one where apparently access for medical is still being held back versus recreational, even though the change to medical access, those were the first court cases that chipped away at the access. So, there's lots of things to be happy about. There's some things to not be happy about. We can only publicly possess 30 grams of dried cannabis or its equivalent in public. But at home, there's no limit. Whereas in most states, there's usually a limit. So you could say, well, 30 grams is in some states that would be considered low. In some states, well, that's similar to the 28 grams that they have. And some states, they have a higher private possession. I know in Michigan, they do that. I don't know if there's any states, you might be able to answer this better than me, that doesn't have any private at-home limits, but I'm pretty sure all of them do, even if those are sort of high limits. Whereas in Canada, as long as you're not possessing it for the purpose of distributing to a third party, selling it to a third party, and it's not illicit cannabis, you grew it properly, or you possessed it properly, legally, there's no limit. So you could have like a giant humidor weed seller of cannabis if you want, as long as you're not, selling it or unlawful.
Which they do. They actually sell those large humidors where you can actually grow. I had a guy on my show that was selling these armoires that are big armoires, so you can press a button, it grows your cannabis for you.
Oh yeah.
This whole thing with this model, and
but I will say that we are limited by a number of plants to 4 plants at home. So I shouldn't say everything's unlimited.
Right. How many plants you grow? Yeah. Same thing with states, and like in California, for instance, when we created the recreational cannabis program here, the laws, the medicinal, if you had a medicinal, there really is no medicinal. There is, but there really isn't, because the only benefit that you get is that you're able to purchase more cannabis when you go into a dispensary. If you have a medicinal card, I think you're limited to maybe 28 grams at a time or something like that. I don't remember off the top of my head. But you can walk into a dispensary next door to you and buy 28 more. So, but if you have a medical card, I don't think you have limitations on how much you can purchase. That's the only issue. Yeah.
So we don't have that sort of system where you walk in and there's a medical side or a rec side, or they're both. But there's some added perks if you're medical. So you just go into the store and everyone's treated the same, for better or worse. But definitely there are people that access. They use it medically, and they go to the recreational store because they don't want to wait for it to come in courier. I once waited as a medical patient 30 days for a package, and it never ended up coming. And it wasn't the fault of the producer; it was the fault of Canada Post. They were having a strike or some other delay, and that's the bottleneck. That's if I was going to court, I would say that the real bottleneck on reasonable access is relying on Canada Post, and we have a geographically dispersed country. You can get a medical sales license if you have a facility where you possess it, or you can have a facility where it's a drop shipping facility, but then it has to come directly from a processor and then be shipped right to the end patient. And so there are some medical sellers that have their licensing, and they use couriers that can deliver same day, but that same day delivery is only going to be in metropolitan areas. There's lots of people in rural areas. So there are some licensed producers or sellers of medical cannabis in Toronto where you sign up for them. And if you order it by a certain time, they'll be able to send it via courier that same day. But usually there's an extra cost to that. And what if you're not in Toronto? What if you're somewhere else? And so it's really unfortunate that whereas in many states, the medical program will get you the same, if not more access than the recreational program, you're still being held back here. And one of the anyways, go ahead.
No. Well, I was going to say what you just said. We're having the same challenge in the recreational states as you are in Canada. So when I was in Toronto last year, I went to 6 different dispensaries, and I had conversations with people, and I said, "What are your highest selling products?" And they were different in every store. And what are people buying? How? And he goes, you can't even evoke, we have a law, you can't even evoke emotion with your marketing. So everything looks the same, unless it's a US brand or something that's brought in, like another product that has branding that came from the US. It sort of gets around it some way, but I'll defer to you as an attorney. I don't know.
I know it doesn't matter where the brand comes from, but there has been envelope pushing. The laws apply to all brands that are in Canada. Certainly you could argue that if there's a US company that only advertises in the US, that it doesn't come under the purview of the Cannabis Act. But once you come to Canada, you need to make those considerations. There's definitely been envelope pushing by the producers in terms of what's allowed and what's not. I mean, even the definition in the Cannabis Act, the prohibition on evoking emotions, including
which shook me out, man. I'm telling you, I walked in what do you mean? What if I'm looking at this and it makes me sad or makes me happy?
Right.
Like, how do you
Right.
police
So,
that? It was
Health
odd.
Canada would be good to put out guidelines, but they don't want to be held to specific guidelines. They want to have an expansive definition that, may catch conduct in the future they're not aware of now. So there's certain things in the law where you read it in the law and you say, well, what does that mean? For example, you can't, you generally can't show an informational promotion
Right.
to someone via telecommunication unless you've taken reasonable steps to assure that the person is 18 years or older. Well, what's reasonable steps? They don't outline what reasonable steps are.
Right. It's reasonable.
And
Right.
and
It's
so
up to your interpretation.
you have provinces like Alberta saying, well, reasonable steps for telecommunication includes having a third-party age gate if you're a retailer in Alberta before people can see any of the products. You have to put your ID in or put your information in, and then a third-party database checks it. Whereas most provinces and how they've been interpreting it, they've said, well, you can have an age gate where it asks for the person's age. But Health Canada has, on one hand, they put out a bulletin saying simple self-attestation can be circumventable. But then when I ask them, well, what does it mean? What is the requirement? They say, well, it's up to each party to determine. And I haven't seen guidelines from them since, even though, it seems like all the other provinces and how they implement it for their stores or impose it on their private retailers is that, well, you can have an age gate, ask them their birth date. That's what I tell clients. That no legal advice here, but I generally tell clients that, look, there's a possibility Health Canada can write in, but all the other provinces except Alberta have interpreted it to allow an age gate that doesn't have to check third parties. But it's, Health Canada can come out and say, you know what, this is the standard now, so they can change the interpretation, they can change their enforcement. Nothing is ever guaranteed and nothing is ever in stone.
Yeah. And so, like, the whole thing with my experience, and I'm trying to relate that to the recreational versus medicinal in the States, because every state is different. You guys have a federal program. We have a state-by-state program. So I'm trying to figure out which state is more similar to what Canada's federal program is. But going into these dispensaries, it seems to me what people are drawn to, because it's just yellow labels everywhere, except for, I think, Seth Rogen's brand Houseplant. I think that actually had a little bit of branding to that, and I don't know how they get away with that.
Well, what you can do is you can have vanity packaging, which is packaging that is not the final packaging because it doesn't comply with the regulations, but it's used to promote the brand. So you have in-store displays, you have vanity. You can have in-store promotions generally in the case where youth are not able to be in the store, which for most provinces, they don't allow people under 19 or 18 generally. And the minimum age federally is 18. So if it's a province where cannabis stores, you cannot let youth in, that's the rules in that province, then you can have in-store promotion generally from a federal perspective. So
when they buy the finished product, let's say they buy a tincture, they buy a jar, that has the regular yellow label on it. It's just a promotion that's in the store
the promotions in the store, they, as long as you follow the promotions, that it can't be to young people. I mean, even though it's a young people aren't allowed there, you still have to follow the regulations. It can't be something that, you have the lifestyle advertising. You can't have paid for testimonials. So that still applies in that context, but you can have brand preference promotion that's using colors. You can have informational promotion, which is factual information about the product that you're using to promote it. Those are the two main buckets of
without claims, though. You cannot. Nothing can make any type of claim on it.
Correct? Well, you can't make health claims. Yeah, if you make health claims, then it becomes under the purview of the Food and Drugs Act, and then there's other requirements you have to. So basically, you can't make you can't make you can't make claims that it's going to diagnose or treat certain conditions.
Got it. So similar to what California is, because not a vertical state, like Florida is a medicinal, fully verticalized, and the company has to grow it, has to cure whatever, cultivate it, distribute it, and sell it in their own retail locations. So what I noticed when I was in Toronto, that when I was talking to them, the only differentiator that people kind of connect to is the percentage of THC.
Yeah.
So they're saying that the products that are selling more than others are the ones that are a higher THC product. So going back to the whole, all right, well, it's medicinal, it's therapeutic, whatever you want to believe, whatever science is. To me, if I want a medicinal product, I'm not looking for the highest THC. I'm looking for a product that aligns better with me and my condition based on research, my terpene profile, maybe minor cannabinoids. What is that going to look like? So there's no way to be able to differentiate that.
The market is waking up to that. We have now CBG products. We don't have everything under the sun, like we don't have Delta 8.
Right. Which is a good thing, by the way.
Yeah, there's it sounds like a regulator's nightmare, to be honest. There's nothing saying that you can't have that. Right. But I imagine that if a company starts putting it out, Health Canada will very quickly say, oh, no, we got to put a lid on that. There is some experimentation with some producers are producing, I believe, THCO, and they're saying that because it's not THC, it doesn't actually attract the excise duty, which is the $1 per gram, or generally that's what the producer has to pay, $1 per dried gram, and then there's another calculation for extracts. But if you can do that, if you can make that, and there's demand for it, and you don't have to pay the excise duty, that'll be huge. Of course, Health Canada will then probably put out some guidelines with the Ministry of Finance saying, well, this is what you have to pay for. Or they'll enact some new regulations, or maybe they'll have to tell the politicians, hey, you have to change the actual Excise Act, the actual legislation. But there's definitely envelope pushing. But it's done, I would say, in a tasteful manner, right?
Well, the reason why I even brought that up originally is because if I'm guided to these products that have high THC, and and you're saying that a medical patient has to wait sometimes if they're in Manitoba, or they're in Yukon, or somewhere that's more remote, and they're waiting, they want their medicine, they need it for whatever condition they have. They can go into a dispensary that's a recreational dispensary, and they may be able to circumvent it and get their product. But
those dispensaries, I'm sure what you're getting at is, they're not very attuned to the needs of medical users.
Exactly what I'm getting.
It's high. It's high THC is the name of the game. So you don't really see too many CBD, or at least too many CBD only products in stores. There might be some like a case of topicals the store has. But generally, if it's going to have CBD, it's a balance of CBD, THC. But there are a number of stores. I've walked into a number of stores, and they still have at least one CBD only drink, and so, which is a good strategy. If you're a retail store, you never want to say no to someone, even if that means only keeping 1 or 2 cases of that specific product segment in. So, but it's not as voluminous in terms of what they have in the back in terms of CBD as well as CBG. But CBG at least is coming onto the market now, even the recreational market. So we're seeing a bit of a blurring of those lines between medical and non-medical here. Yeah.
Right. Well, so I heard you somewhere speaking, I don't remember where, or maybe I read, because you're a pretty prolific writer on the subject too. I read some of the stuff. Was it in Leafly that you were writing? Some other places. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I've been reading some of your stuff just to kind of get familiar with your work. And one of the interesting things that you talk about and like I said, I don't remember if it was in a talk or if it
Mm.
was in writing, but you talk about DINs, right? You talk about the how do we get this to be a really medical product? We can call medical therapeutic, but how do we get this to a point where it is really medicine? And you had an interesting description about the drug IDs and all that stuff. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that, because I like to kind of dig a little bit deeper on that subject.
Yeah, so in Canada, cannabis, medical cannabis, let's take a step back. So all drugs in Canada that are packaged and marketed for end use by a patient, generally they have to have what's called a drug identification number. And insurers in Canada, we have a system where generally hospital visits are covered. Going to a family physician is covered by the province, the government. However, drugs, prescriptions typically aren't covered by the provincial governments of the jurisdiction you live in. There are some programs if you're low income, but generally you have to either have private insurance, which you get through your employer. There are some plans you can get if you don't have an employer, but you have to pay out of pocket for that. And so the coverage of drugs that those insurance companies pay for are typically limited to drugs that have drug identification numbers. Cannabis, medical cannabis that's sold in Canada, unless it goes through the rigors of the Food and Drugs Act of a drug, which, there are many requirements. It's the same as any other prescription drug. Unless it goes through the rigors of that, it's not going to have a drug identification number. So there was a time when insurers were not covering medical cannabis, and some still don't, but there's been much more of an acceptance of medical cannabis, typically for unions in Canada. They have been allowing their members, if they are prescribed by a doctor, to be covered up to a certain amount of grams per day, or a certain percentage, 80% or some other percentage of their spend. But insurers used to be very hesitant. And I remember being told by someone who was really pushing for that coverage. He said it's going to come down to the employers, right? At the end of the day, the employers are the ones that have these these private insurance plans, typically for their employees. And we saw a push by unions to make sure that the insurance plans that they had some sort of access to medical cannabis, or they were pushed by the members who then pushed them. So that is, I don't want to say that's a bit of an older issue, but now that you brought it up, I will say that it's more accepted for insurers to cover medical cannabis, as well as the government. The federal government itself covers medical cannabis, generally up to 3 grams for those that are veterans.
Interesting.
Whereas before it was a different process. But now generally, if you have a medical document, no matter what it's for, you'll generally be covered by the federal program. So I would say insurance has definitely got better. It's not perfect, and I don't know of any system where 100% of all of your grammage is going to be covered. Right. A doctor can theoretically write a big script, so it's always typically limited by percentage that's covered and or a per gram daily limit. And after that, you have to pay out of pocket for it. But if you're a veteran and you find relief in cannabis, there have been some critics that say the cost has ballooned, which it has, right. From what it was even just a couple of years ago. But for better or worse, that system's there. And so if you are a veteran and you find relief from medical cannabis, you will have the ability to not have to pay out of pocket for a certain amount of that access.
Well, what you just explained makes total sense, because that's the reason why somebody wants to wait to get their cannabis in the mail, because it's being covered by either your insurance or federal government. And it doesn't matter on a qualifying condition anymore. As long as you have a script from a doctor, Now you're a medical patient. Now you can get access to medical cannabis and it's covered, correct?
Yeah. Yeah, and the provincial bodies, the regulatory bodies of the doctors and nurse practitioners, they're the ones that, you know, look into the doctors and see if anyone's doing anything that they shouldn't be doing. And it's, you know, the physicians have to be careful. It has to be someone that's under your care. You have to do a proper evaluation. You know, certainly I know the, you know, reputation of California is you can get one from anywhere.
So I don't want to name the name. I don't want to name the company, but my last, I get a medical card. I've always gotten a medical card, even though you don't really need it. You can go anywhere. Right. There's no benefit, but I just like to have one. So the last conversation I had with somebody was a physician through a telemed, like we're talking now. Within, I would say 30 seconds, less than a minute of a conversation, we're still talking about whether, I use cannabis for this and this. I think you should continue using cannabis. Within less than a minute, I was told by this physician, this female physician, she told me that my card is already emailed to me, and she already got the card that's going in the mail. So I have the actual card in the mail. We're continuing talking, but the card is already done. So that was my renewal process.
Did they have a lengthy intake process in terms of the questions they made you ask?
No.
You see, that's the difference in Canada.
But it's a renewal. Right. So my very first one, yes. So the very, very first card I ever got was, I think, in 2009, 2010, something like that. So the process, I went to a doctor. I had an exam. He actually asked me to send, you know, whatever my medical information was from my other doctor to review. I paid $250 for that card, and he said he will support me in court. Like if something happens, I have to go to court, he can be a witness in court as part of the process. So the last time that I had my card was that I paid, I don't know, $30 maybe, give or take, and it was a 30-second process. That's the difference.
Yeah. No, so there's definitely differences between here and where you are.
So I have a couple more questions about Canada, just so I can understand and the audience can understand. So in what's happening? All these companies went public, right? And I don't know if you even have any insight on this. I'm just curious if because you're on the ground there. All these companies went public. You know, people dumped all this money into the public markets and all these big Canadian companies, and then, you know, the stock didn't meet expectations, let's just say. So for the investors, and basically that sort of ripple effect is hitting everybody in the space. So, you know, money's tight. People don't want to invest in cannabis now. They're concerned. The shiny new object is psychedelics, which I'll get into with you in a minute. But from your perspective, what happened, what's happening, and what's going to be sort of the future of this?
Well, the capital markets have really dried up for cannabis. There's an oversupply of cannabis on the market. That doesn't mean that you can't make money. That doesn't mean you can have a really kick-ass brand in the market. There are companies that are making money, and there are companies that are doing well, and they're differentiating themselves, whether it's a cannabis producer or retail stores. But on the other hand, if you're a new entrant in the market, or you're an existing entrant in the market, but you're seeking capital, you know, the capital markets have dried up in a sense. And we'll probably see a bit of a resurgence in that. Similar to psychedelics, there was a drying up of the market. You know, it's unfortunate to see, but the market just has to figure itself out. But otherwise, we have a vibrant cannabis industry here. I would say it's not without problems, but hopefully in the long-term scale of things, they'll be fixed relatively soon.
So Harrison, who's your ideal client? Is it like a a large cannabis conglomerate? Is it somebody that wants to open up a dispensary? Like, who
Yeah,
comes to you?
so a lot of my work has focused on the retail market in Ontario.
Got it.
So independent mom and pop operators that want to set up a cannabis retail store. For a lot of them, it's their first cannabis business, but they know that it's something they want to be in. And so I help guide them through the process. And I've had larger clients that are applicants to become producers, for example, individual patients who are just looking to get their growth certificate, because you can get a certificate from Health Canada that allows you to grow personally or have a designated grower. And so it's a wide range of different people in the industry. But up until now, I've focused a lot on retail. And retail, there's been, some would say an oversaturation, at least some sort of saturation, you will say, with retail, at least in Ontario, although that's not to say you still can't open up a location in an underserved area. And so those still exist, but it's 2022 is definitely different than 2021. So I'm making sure that I'm able to service all the other people in the industry besides retail applicants.
So how did you make the bridge or the addition of psychedelics into your practice?
Yeah, so it's a similar, let's see, I should say it's controlled in a similar fashion. The fact that you have this federally top-heavy regime to regulate both cannabis and psychedelics, and they both come, at least originally, from the CDSA. There's also the Food and Drug Act. You need to, if you're in one, you need to know at least a bit about the other, and vice versa. So it's a natural fit. I don't practice as much psychedelic law as I do cannabis. But it's definitely been interesting to give advice to individuals and people who want to be a part of the sector. The requirements are a bit different if you want to produce and sell wholesale, I should say, or sell to clinical trials psychedelics. But for better or worse, there's no system just set up for psychedelics like there is the Medical Cannabis Act and regulations. Health Canada sort of lumps all the controlled, the restricted drugs, I should say, into one category. And so it's definitely a different regime, but a lot of the enabling acts, the enabling legislation, comes from the same legislation.
So for psychedelics right now, because you have different types, like you have psilocybin from mushrooms, so somebody would want to grow that and cultivate that, and then provide that for research purposes, right? So that's one. But what if it's LSD, for instance, or is that completely different than the regulations for the psilocybin or ibogaine or
so it's a little bit confusing. We'll see if I can explain it without making you go, huh? So in Canada, we have the Food and Drugs Act, which is a act that regulates all drugs, which are pretty much substances that are represented to change the modify organic function is what the definition, what the provision says. Within that, you have what's called restricted drugs, which are all the, I guess you could say, psychedelics are in restricted drugs. You, as an end user and patient, cannot generally possess restricted drugs unless you have an exemption from the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, which is another act that is the criminal legislation, criminal law legislation with respect to controlled substances. So you have two different acts, and you have the same drugs are there are some drugs that are controlled substances under the CDSA that might not be regulated as Food and Drug Act or vice versa. But generally, you'll find that a substance is regulated under both. Under the CDSA, it's a controlled substance, whereas under the Food and Drug Act, it's a restricted drug. Restricted drugs, you need to, if you're an end patient, be under a Section 56 exemption, or you need to be getting it through a clinical trial, which has a Section 56 exemption, or you need to have it through a, you need to be able to, or it will be accessible to you by the Special Access Program, which is its own program under the Food and Drugs Act, that allows you to access or get administered to you certain restricted drugs. And there is a CDSA exemption to protect, because the substance would exist in both the CDSA and FDA.
Right.
If it's exempt in the FDA's, you still need to have an exemption in the criminal law for it. So basically, Health Canada said that restricted drugs, which is a bucket of drugs under the Food and Drugs Act, they can now be applied for under the Special Access Program, which is sort of like a right to try program, where if it's an emergency drug that might not otherwise be in Canada, it can be authorized by Health Canada if a physician writes in. In this case, you can do that for restricted drugs. However, the CDSA criminal law against possession of what is controlled drugs, which overlaps with restricted drugs, still applies. And so there is a exemption from the CDSA for practitioners and their agents, which are like psychotherapists, to administer MDMA and psilocybin to patients that otherwise have accessed it lawfully. So although restricted drugs, you can generally apply to access them as a physician, you'll still be barred under the criminal law, the CDSA, from doing anything with it unless it's just psilocybin and MDMA, and your possession is for the purpose of administering it to your patient. And through that Special Access Program, patients can't even possess the psilocybin themselves, because they're still under the CDSA. They're still criminally liable if they possess it. They have to be
they have to administer it at the physician's office.
Exactly. So there's these two legislations where one says go, one says stop. The one that says stop says, oh well, we'll actually carve out a small exemption that can be used for some of those restricted drugs, and only by the physicians. And so if you're a patient that goes through the program that Health Canada has now established for psychedelics, for I guess psilocybin and MDMA at least, you can't actually possess it yourself. You have to be administered it, which does bring up some interesting points. How can you not possess it if you're being handed a capsule or some sort of substance? In this case, it's GMP certified psilocybin. So it's actually given to patients in powder form, in synthetic form. Although there's some now producers saying we're going to make GMP level natural psilocybin, the fruiting, what would you say, the fruiting bodies. Where were we there? Anyways, basically, it begs the question of, how can you administer it without the patient possessing it?
You have to possess it, because it's the same thing in the US with cannabis, if you really think about it, and also psychedelics. But if you think about it, because it's federally illegal, it's still a Schedule I substance. States make it legal, but even some states, it's illegal to possess. Some of them say it's not, you can consume, but you can't possess. So how do you consume without possessing it first? So it just makes no sense. They need to either deschedule or completely reschedule. And, part of me kind of understands the cannabis challenges, because you have so many different constituents in the plant, right? And pharma and DEA and FDA and all that stuff, it's like one molecule, and we can take it through clinical trials. But with cannabis, it's many different molecules. But for psychedelics, I think maybe there's a faster way to get this done, because you're looking at it's psilocybin, psilocin in your brain. It's MDMA, so you can measure serotonin, all the other things. So it doesn't have the constituents of these many different substances, and I think it'll make it easier for them to go.
For a producer of you could say active pharmaceutical ingredients, so the base chemical, there's pretty much two routes you can go. You can go the route of manufacturing an existing drug, or coming up with an analog, and it might not be controlled by the CDSA, but it's still controlled by the FDA because it modifies organic function, and so you still need to get it. That's where the drug identification number comes in, and in order to get that, you need to show that it's efficacious and safe. So there's pros and cons to both, but obviously, if you have your own new analog, your own new chemical that that you're able to file a patent for, there's going to be no safety data, no evidence. Whereas, at least generally for psilocybin as a category, as the existing sort of generic substance, we have some clinical trials coming out, and there will be clinical trials for these analogs as well. Some of them will work. There's tremendous promise for a lot of substances, but it seems like there's an analog or an indication that might be possible for any different kind of condition that might be possible. It has to go through clinical trial. This analog or that might not be good for weight loss, even though it might have seemed at the beginning by the researchers to be a possible. So there will be some successes in the psychedelics field, and there will be times when companies will have to say, sorry, it wasn't successful. We can't use it for this indication.
Hey, I mean, we went through this with Epidiolex and Sativex, right? With GW Pharmaceuticals. Epidiolex went through, even though it had some challenges, and they had a bunch of black box warnings for liver and all that stuff because high amount CBD, and Sativex didn't. And I think they sell a derivative that some places in Europe, I don't know about Canada, but it didn't go through the phase 3 trial. And the phase 3, if I'm not mistaken, is scale. So phase 1 is safety, phase 2 is efficacy. Now that you pass those, now it's scale. And somewhere in the scale, I think got hung up maybe.
Yeah, so I'm not aware off the top of my head of its status in Canada, but certainly there are licensed producers that are also authorized medical sellers of cannabis that have products that are relatively high CBD, and that's what people who rely on CBD ingested orally, those are the kind of products that they rely on.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you about the NFT stuff really quick. So an NFT lawyer, like, what does that entail? I'm not even 100% familiar with. I mean, I get it what an NFT is, I think, but I'm not even 100% like familiar with it because I don't own any NFTs.
Yeah, so I provide legal assistance in respect of non-fungible tokens.
Right.
And so if it's NFT projects, artists that need assistance, companies that are looking to launch their own NFT projects, I'm assisting them with legal advice. And I'm a bit of an NFT collector myself, and I think it's going to change the world. It's almost going to be so ubiquitous that we don't even think about it. It doesn't even surprise us. Oh, this is an NFT. I mean, NFTs are unique entries on a distributed database that can then be attached to URLs or real world assets. And so it can be used as provenance. It can be used to identify people. It can be used to gain access into events, places. It can signify social status. So there's a lot of crap out there in terms of the profile picture projects that aren't promising, or the art is very rudimentary. And sometimes that's the point, is that the art is rudimentary. And so it's sort of, there's a bit of a meta joke you could say about some projects that they're not as polished as others, but they say, hey, that's part of us, and we're on chain, so you can see our artwork. It's on the blockchain, but that means it sort of looks a bit pixelated, blocky. And so there are some projects that embrace that and embrace the new but sometimes limited world of blockchain, and use it to their advantage. So yes, there's a lot of projects out there that you might not find interesting, or that might not be valuable at the end of the day as something to collect. But the technology is here, and it's here to stay.
So if I was
replace anything that's a unique asset that needs to be tracked.
Right. So yeah, we were thinking about, because we do DNA testing and stuff. So we were thinking about having some sort of NFT, because we've done things on the blockchain before, but if you have a way to be able to access your unique genetic profile and then have that in the blockchain and have an NFT as the actual way to access that data, but we're still playing with it because I frankly don't know enough. So I'm trying to.
Yeah, there are some applications of it where things are not fleshed out yet, and so companies are right to, in certain instances, to say we're not going to touch it until it's fleshed out. But certainly for access, for allowing access and allowing transferability, it's a great alternative to centrally located databases, right? And we use databases for everything.
So if I wanted to sort of dip my toe in the water, do you have a certain place somewhere I should take a look at, something that would be of interest to start getting into the NFT space?
For the law in relation to NFT and cryptocurrency, there's a book called Blockchain and the Law. It's by crypto lawyer Aaron Grinhouse. It's put out by some academic publisher. You could see it as a crypto law textbook, but it's great, and the new edition of it just came out a couple months ago, and so that really explains the law. Otherwise, there's a book that I'm reading called The Cryptopians. There we go. And it's a great book about crypto and the various characters that are part of it.
Got it. Cool. Well, I have some other questions for you that I ask all my guests. And I always tell everybody they're really difficult to get ready, but I'm not going to do that because they're not. They're just fun questions. So let's please describe your first experience with cannabis.
My first experience with cannabis. My first experience with cannabis was I tried the cannabis, and I got a very interesting effect that I don't think I felt since then. Everything seemed like a flip book, and my stomach hurt, and my vision got very clouded. To this day, I have no clue why that happened, because it's not representative of what I or other colleagues have experienced with cannabis. And I was actually turned off by it at first. I said, if this is what people experience, I don't want to do this. And then I tried it again another time, and I didn't have that experience. And then when it comes to the practice of cannabis law, that was really introduced to me through Alan Young, which is the professor who I wrote the entrance essay about. And he had cannabis cases, some criminal matters, where we assisted people who were charged with cannabis criminal offenses. So that was my first foray into cannabis law and how it can help people, and seeing how there can be laws, or at least back then there were laws that seemed to, go against the greater good.
Yeah, and you brought up an interesting point about your personal experience. I mean, that's the whole point of our business, is because it's always a personal experience with cannabis, and not all cannabis is created equal. So if you have a genetic predisposition to something and you're consuming something that can trigger that genetic expression in you, it may have an adverse experience. You know, so it's a lot of different factors that go into it. That's why you want to make sure that you know this in advance, what you're putting in your body. I mean, everything we put in our body, we should know what it is, including, any kind of drug, which is cannabis for sure. So I'm a big music guy. Do you remember the very first concert you ever attended was?
A very first concert. I don't recall. That's a good question. I should think about that someday.
What was the last concert?
What was the last concert? I think the last concert I went to was Electric Forest in Michigan.
Got it.
It's the sixth year I've been there. It's a electronic forest, and it's an electronic festival in a forest,
Right.
and it's a lot of fun each and
Yeah,
every
like
year.
EDM kind of thing, right?
Electronic music, there are
Yeah.
jam bands, so String Cheese Incident is there. It's a nice
Oh,
cross
okay.
of people, you know, a lot of young people. Then you have old people, you have people who say, oh, I was there at Woodstock, and it's
That's very
a lot
cool.
of fun, a lot of interesting people.
Uh, do you remember what the first like album or CD or tape that you ever got?
Well, my dad used to play a lot of 80s music and on the radio when we were in his car. And so one of my favorite bands is called Spoons, and you've probably never heard of them, not Spoon.
Spoon?
Spoons, not Spoon.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
they're in Canada though. They never really they opened for a bunch of back in the 80s. They're an 80s band. They opened for a bunch of big acts and who came to Toronto, like Police. There's
Yeah.
you know, I'm not from the 80s. I was born in the 90s, and so I like their music. I just like their music. I obviously wasn't around for it, but they were one of the first bands that I remember hearing on the radio. And that's because in Canada, generally radio stations have to play approximately 35% Canadian content.
Yep.
And so there's, I guess, only so much new wave music that comes out of Canada. You start hearing the same things over and over again.
Yeah.
So they're a favorite band of mine, and they still perform, which is very interesting.
So my next question was if there's anything you're listening to these days that are of interest that you want to share. But Spoons is that's one I haven't heard of, so that would be that's one. But is there anything else that you are listening
Well,
to these days?
I just like listening to electronic music.
Yeah.
Rufus Du Sol, they're a newer band. And actually I saw them in concert. That might have actually been after Electric Forest.
There you go.
So there you go, Rufus Du Sol. They're a bigger band, but their electronic music, but it seems everything they put out is just so wonderful, so melodic. And then they have other people doing remixes of their tracks, and those are usually very high quality.
Super cool. Appreciate that. What has cannabis meant in your life?
Well, I think it's, you know, it's meant my livelihood, right? I've been able to pay the bills as a cannabis lawyer. And so it's very important, and it brings a lot of good people together, I would say. You know, whether that's people who want to consume it or people who are just in it for the business of it. You know, you need to make sure you come at it from an angle where you respect the plant, you respect the culture of it. And a lot of people in it are very cool, interesting people. And so that's what it's meant for me.
Love that. All right. So final question, bonus question. Please describe what your room looked like growing up.
My room, what did my room look like growing up? Well, I had artwork all around it because my dad collected art. And so it was I had a nice room, you know. It was nice.
What type of art? Like, did you have posters in the wall of any music?
So there was some abstract art. There's a little bit of everything on the walls. I didn't choose it. I didn't, you know, I was just, you know, came home one day and, oh, this is my room, and here's some artwork in it.
It was selected for you.
Yeah. And so no, I've been blessed to have lived a very good upbringing, and yeah, my room was filled with art. And so sometimes I'd have friends come over and they say, oh, this is cool. And I have to say, don't touch it. You know, that's technically my dad's art. But
That's funny. I hear you. Where can people contact you? Where can people find out more about you? Social?
Yeah, Harrison Jordan Law. That's my website. I'm also on Twitter as Harjord.
Got it. Well, Harrison, I want to thank you so much for being on. Everything is personal. It's really good. And
yeah, this is a great one.
Yeah, and I appreciate your time, man. Thank you so much.
Take care.